All right, we are here for episode 7 of Theologize. Coming back to putting out the episodes once a week. Originally, I had posted on my Instagram story that my wife Lucy was going to be a part of this episode, and we were going to do basically marriage talks and sort of just open up about our marriage, and I was going to bring in a little bit of theology of marriage and just struggles and areas where we are getting better, and just so it would be an encouragement. But that didn't work out today. That will hopefully be coming in the future. I also have a few guests lined up for some remote podcasts coming up in the next few weeks to talk about, which we're going to be talking about today, culture impacting the church or the church impacting culture. We're just going to discuss it, have some questions, go back and forth. I'll introduce my guest shortly. And then we're going to continue and elaborate on that in the next few weeks with another guest. And then a few weeks down the road, I believe sometime in February, we are going to talk about women and leadership in the church. So if you guys are interested in any of those topics, they are coming. And I'll keep posting on my social media platforms to let you guys know when they're out. And we're going to keep going with this podcast known as Theologize. So before I introduce my guest today, I want to talk about a big event that is happening tomorrow in Washington, D.C., and that is the inauguration. Now, I know that people listening to this podcast might be on both sides of the spectrum. You might be all for who was elected president, or you might be completely against the idea of Joe Biden being our next president. But wherever you are, wherever you stand on that spectrum, on the scale, what you do need to realize is that as of right now, in this time, he has been appointed by the American people, and not just by the American people. From what we see, he has been appointed by God, and it is our duty as American citizens, as Bible-believing Christians, to be praying for our leaders. Doesn't matter how much we like them. So tomorrow, I encourage you, as the inauguration is taking place, with whatever happens, that you be praying for the leaders, the future leaders of this country, the current leaders in your state governments, in your local governments, and in your national governments. I think that is something that we were called to do by God, that we are commanded to do, actually, is to be praying for them, in prayer, supporting them. So just want to encourage you guys that. That's a little bit of what's going on in the world and how to respond to it biblically, or specifically what's going on in America and how to respond to that biblically. So without further ado, we are going to introduce our guest today. He is actually my father. His name is Alex Hromyk. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, David. Glad to be here tonight.
So I thought it was fitting that I have you on the podcast today, and I sort of dropped this on last minute. How did you feel about that?
Yes, it was last minute after having a nice dinner, sitting there discussing a few things with our in-laws, and then you asked me to do this podcast with you, or this broadcast with you.
Yeah, and you were trying to make every excuse in the book to get out of it, but
because it is pretty late, right?
No, maybe if you're 62, one. I'm just kidding. I just turned 30, so it's also getting late for me now. But I wanted to introduce you, and I thought you would be fitting to be on the podcast today because we grew up in two very different church styles. For a while, I was part of a church that you had grown up in, or at least had been a part of your life, a majority of your life in. But it wasn't always the way it was when I was even growing up there. So I wanted to get a little bit of your background on what American church was like for you. Well, it wasn't American, it was actually Slavic, but it had a lot of American tendencies at the time, but still a lot different from what we see in church today. So can you explain a little bit of what it was like for you growing up in the church here?
Yeah, growing up in Russian/American-speaking churches was very interesting. On Sundays, you would hear a preacher either speaking Russian, and then translation would be into English language, and that was really awesome. I think in that way it served a purpose also in reaching out to those who were lost. And a lot of times many English American-speaking people would come to church because they liked the way the Russian people worshiped. They liked the hymns that were being sung. It was hymns that they were familiar with, so they could sing out of the English hymnal. whereas a Russian person would sing from the Russian hymnal, but the same melody. So it was a very interesting combination, and sometimes I kind of miss that. We don't really have that here where we live right now.
And that's what I want to talk about, because I don't know. I think we moved about 12, 13 years ago from California, and while the church may have seemed like that in our memory, and even for myself, going to camps or different youth events as a kid, I wonder why it's a lot different now than it was back then. And I think that it's almost nostalgic. There's a nostalgia to it that I think that if you kind of go back to those songs, go back to that style of preaching, go back to those fellowship or youth nights or prayer meetings, that you get this extra sense of almost like worship, or it feels more like worship. But I feel a lot of times it could be playing on our emotion. But you said that we don't really get that here. Do you think that you were experiencing that before you had even left Washington?
I think I was for a while there, but we did join an English-speaking church just before we left California. But it was a different feel altogether. It was an American-speaking, English-speaking church, and I always felt like something was missing. We did sing the same kind of hymns, but there just was some type of disconnect, I think, with a lot of the members. They would come in real quick. Their agenda was to just get the sermon and go, where we were kind of more used to, let's go to church and then let's all get together as a youth, or get together and maybe go to somebody's house and socialize after.
So let me ask you this. What was the style of preaching like as opposed to what you hear now in the church?
Well, now I think the sermons are a lot more complex. They're a lot more in-depth. I think what I remember from the past was sermons were not very deep. I'm not sure how to say it otherwise, but more simple, I would say. And many times it was because of the translation. They couldn't say too many complex things because the translation would be lost. The translator would be looking for words that just you didn't know.
While I do really appreciate a good theological sermon or discussion, what I find the most effective for people is the simplicity of the message. I was listening to a conference. We were all listening to it together, and there were two different speakers that I was sort of comparing, and I enjoyed the one that just made the gospel message clear, and basically, this is you, this is God, this is what you can get from God, and this could be the result of what your life can look like. And I thought that was so, boom, boom, point, point, simple, simple. Even though it flowed and he didn't have a point-by-point sermon, he just seemed to make so much sense. It was so simple, so easy to grasp. And so do you think that it was because the gospel itself was the main sermon every Sunday and there was less of like sermon series and teachings? Do you think that people would just get up there and preach the gospel more in the Russian church, or what do you think it was that was making it simple?
I think that they couldn't prepare, or they didn't have enough biblical Bible school training. So a lot of the things that they read, they would just maybe repeat as they were saying the sermon, and maybe a few things they would expound on. So keeping, I think, the gospel very simple and plain and easy to understand, I think it was really helpful for a lot of the youth growing up.
That's interesting. I always enjoyed those youth camps where they would preach a simple gospel message and it was extremely impactful. But as I got older, what I started enjoying more was, we go to a Cornwall currently, and Bob brings what I would say, he likes to bring up some theological points here and there, historical points, philosophical points, different outside resources that people sort of discuss about a certain passage, and he brings that all together into his sermon. And personally, while it might seem a little more complex, I think overall it makes you a more well-rounded Christian, because you're seeing things not just from, and while, the gospel message is important and should continue to be preached in every church, I think that for a more mature Christian, that well-roundedness is extremely important in day-to-day life. Now, some of what we're really going to be talking about today, culture coming into the church and being that becoming a more well-rounded person. Is that something that you think is better or worse, where you bring culture into the church, or do you think it's better that we bring the church into culture? And while the latter seems to be the correct answer, what do you think about culture coming into the church, and do you think that is a bad thing, a good thing, or it's sort of both?
I'm not sure what we mean exactly by culture. Do we mean like the way people might dress? They bring that to the church, or maybe the kind of music that they listen to. That style kind of is brought into the church so that they would also hear something that they like.
Yeah, no, uh it's a little bit of both. I mean, the dressing part, I know that, and I would like to hear your opinion and on this, because we just had a discussion with, our in-laws' grandparents about dressing and modest dressing, and what does that really mean? What is Paul talking about in the scriptures when he tells the women to dress neat and modestly? And we sort of talked about the wearing the suits. So I'd like to hear your opinion on just church wear and what you saw growing up versus what you see now in the church.
Well, growing up, it was not unusual to come to church with nice slacks and a nice shirt, and as you got older, to wear a suit and tie, because this is the way we always thought that church should be. And so I accepted that, and I think I like that because we try to bring our best. Something we know that we're going into church, we're going into a special place to worship God, and we can be comfortable, I guess, with our clothes. We don't always have to wear a tie, but something different. I'm not going to come in to church wearing cleats and shorts, or coming from a tennis game. We're coming into church, but I am going to dress a little bit better than maybe like work clothes.
So I think that that's also, so that speaks very well to kind of exactly where we're talking about culture coming into the church, because at the time, we called my grandfather Diedushka. So this is what we were talking about. Diedushka was presenting, that you should come in a suit, slacks. Women should come in a nice, modest dress. And that was very reflective of the culture that you guys grew up in. So, you would go into work wearing probably a suit most times, or the women would wear a dress. You would go out to lunch in restaurants, dress a little nicer for the most part. And the clothing wear was just different overall. So I think a majority of it is what the culture that you guys grew up in, what was nice and modest, was also expected in the church services. And I think that's still applicable today. Although people might not take these verses as literal these days, I think that what's modest and nice for the common person in today's culture, they'll still try to wear that to church. Do you think that's not true, or what do you think on that?
I think I've seen people in the past try to reach out to, like, say, younger folks, even though they were older, and dress the way that a younger person would dress. I've seen that back a long time ago when we went to, I think it was a Promise Keepers conference, where one of the guys was like a 60, 70-year-old guy, came out with shorts and tennis shoes and like a basketball shirt or something like that to kind of relate to the younger folks. But I think he totally missed the mark, where he should have said, look, I'm a little bit older guy. I dress a little differently. I'm trying to reach out to you, but it's not me to dress differently, to somehow gain acceptance from you. I'm different, and look up to me as a little bit smarter man.
Yeah, wiser, definitely. And with that, even though he might be dressing what they would say is cool or hip for the time, Promise Keepers, this was like 90s, right? Maybe
Yeah,
early
it was
2000s.
90s. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we wouldn't think that looked cool anymore, but he might, although he might be trying to dress all cool, like his personality could be totally the thing that actually attracts these kids versus his dress and wear. Excuse me. And so I think what's more important is the way that we approach, how culture is impacting the church right now. So I think that, and what I mean by that is, you don't need to stoop down to, or I shouldn't say stoop down, that might be a bad way to say it, but you don't need to change the way that you dress, change the way that you behave, or change your viewpoints just to get someone to come to church. That's kind of what you're saying, right?
Right. I'm saying that we should open our doors and say to the people, come as you are, come to meet Jesus, come to the cross just as you are. And we should maybe dress casually more to show people that, they're welcome. They can come in the way they are, especially maybe the area where we live. I think that's a good start. And then as, people accept Christ, people maybe begin to have life-changing things happen in their lives, then, they could maybe dress a little differently, or realize that maybe dress is not that important still to them, and then just call others to live a life, a Christian life.
That's interesting. Oh,
it's a little
you have
confusing.
something else?
No, go ahead.
No. I really appreciate that you're saying that, because it's, the big thing that I have you on the podcast today, and then I'm going to have my friend Paul also to discuss. And obviously he's younger, closer to my age, so he grew up in a different era. So my goal was to just bring on different people in different, eras and cultures. I use the word culture, but it's more of an era. Just, I think the 70s, 80s is when you were a youth member in the church, correct?
Yeah, that's right. We grew up in the 70s, when I remember the main thing in that decade was always talking about the return of Christ. So a lot of movies were about the return of Christ. A lot of the books that were written that were about the return of Christ, like Dave Wilkerson's The Vision, I think it was written in 1974-ish, talking about the future. So that's kind of the era I grew up in. And then being a young man in the 80s, things kind of returned, it seemed like, to a very happy time. And
that's funny that you say those books, movies, sermons about the return of Christ wasn't as much of a happy time. Was it more of scary? Because I know, growing up for myself, the Left Behind series. Do you remember the Left Behind series?
Yeah.
That kind of scarred me. It was, the first book. I think I stopped at that, and then the first book basically talks about how people are at O'Hare International Airport, which I was just at recently, and it re-brought memories up of that book. But people are flying. People are walking in the airport, they're in their homes, and then all of a sudden, they disappear and their clothes are just there, and half the people are gone. And
well, the 70s, I remember, was about the sermons, and all the different books were about the return of Christ. But I saw a focus, a change in the 80s, where I think it was more focusing on grace and God's mercy. So that's what I remember most of the sermons on at that time.
Why do you think that change happened?
I don't know. I think it was people were waiting for something to happen, and maybe they probably got scared by a lot of these books, and then things didn't get fulfilled. And they said, well, let's concentrate on the good things of Christ. Let's look at what the Bible's telling us. And I think that's maybe why a change happened there.
I think that's sort of happening today too. People are seeing all of these things happening in America and the world, especially with COVID and what seems to be craziness in the American government and the American streets and cities. And a lot of people are thinking this is just the signs of end times. So, but I specifically remember, you said the 80s, and then the 90s kind of came about, and then everyone got really scared around 1999, and I remember being in the houses, and people were preaching that this is it. Soon as Y2K, computers are going to stop, the clocks are going to stop, it's the end of the world. You guys even had 2 big barrels in the back to get ready for water.
Yeah, that was a very interesting time too. I remember I was working for a big electronics company at that time, and everybody was scared that all the computer systems wouldn't work right after 1999 to 2000, because everything would just zero out. Everything was based on 4 digits at that time, and I can't remember if exactly what it was, but
You got to tell people you work from AMD. Everyone knows AMD. It wasn't just a little computer company. It
yeah,
was
I just didn't want to give them
trying to stay humble.
didn't want to give them too much credit here. It was been a long time ago, but so anyway, all the computer systems, everything had to be upgraded. It was a really big deal. The company spent a lot of money to upgrade so that it'll go from 1999 to the year 2000. And it's true. I mean, there was a lot of books that were written. People were kind of scared, so someone gave us a
lot of prophecies. I'm sure.
A lot of prophecies. People gave us a couple of barrels just in case. Why don't you take these? So we also filled them up with water, and it's 21 years plus, and we just don't see it.
Yeah, but it does seem like it's getting worse now. But that shouldn't, and this is kind of back to our original topic, is the church, technically, biblically speaking, should not be swayed by culture, right?
Yeah.
Like the church should stand, based on what we see happening in the world, the church should stand firm on its belief system, and that's the gospel, and that's that Jesus is our saving grace, and he is our rock that we are built on. That should be our deterrence from fear and anxiety and worry, right?
That's right. We talked about that this evening, where the covenant is actually the cross, and God made a covenant with us through the cross of Jesus Christ, and that is that should never change. That's where we always come and bow down and realize that we're sinners and ask for forgiveness and surrender our lives to Christ. That part is not a cultural thing. That is a truth that lasts through all ages. But I guess cultural things I always think of as, clothing, music, hairstyles, those kind of things.
Yeah, and in the grand scheme of it, when we truly think about the gospel and all of that, it becomes irrelevant. I mean, you want to obviously be the best version of yourself overall and dress the best you can and be presentable as a person, but when it comes to Jesus, it doesn't really matter what you smell like, or what your hair looks like, or what specific you're wearing. He kind of sees past the physical. In fact, that's all going to be here and burnt away anyway, the materials of this world, and even our flesh is not going to remain with us, whether we lost an arm or we have a mole somewhere on our cheek, or missing fingers, or whether we can't walk or in a wheelchair. That's all going to deteriorate itself too, and that's something that we got to remember. And I've heard church culture say, if you're crippled or injured or something bad happened to you, and this isn't what we see in today's day and age. Maybe you saw this a little more in church culture when you were growing up, but that those things, that the bad that has come upon you as a result of some sin in your life. Have you heard that?
Yeah, we've heard a lot of that, but a lot of the friends that I've grown up with, some of them were handicapped and things like that, and I knew it wasn't anything that they've done, so those things I never believed. And I remember even praying for a lot of these people. They'd come up to the front of the church in those days, and people would pray for them for healing, and it just didn't happen. Those kind of healings just didn't happen. So we thought, well, God's purpose is greater in having this person to be the way they are. And when you talk to this person, you can see a sweet character, sweet personality, a real genuine, down-to-earth person that cares about what you're saying. And I think that is because of what he or she has gone through, that they can sympathize with others who are hurting.
Yes, and that it always comes back to that Scripture is the thing that's unchanging for people, and it doesn't matter if you're crippled, handicapped in any way, or if you can walk, run, play basketball, or play sports, golf. The gospel is the gospel, and that's the most important thing to Jesus. That's the most important thing to him in regards to what current affairs, and that's the most important thing to him in regards to latest fashions and latest trends and social media, TikTok trends. The most important thing to him is his gospel message, and how we receive that, and how we, if we have such good news, how we disperse that to the world around us. It's so much better than anything we can wear or bring to the church, or style of music that we can bring to the church. But I wanted to go back to what we were just talking about covenant earlier, and all of this ties in with we talked about contract versus covenant and how we're not in a contract with God. And right now, a lot of people, I feel like, with how they're living their life, with everything happening in America or in the world, with COVID, people are acting like this is more of a contract with God. Well, you're not fulfilling the needs of what's going on with COVID. You're not fulfilling the needs of what's going on financially. So therefore, I can't fulfill my end of the contract and stay in a relationship with you. But that's not how he set it up. He set it up as a covenant, which is a lifetime oath, a selfless giving of ourselves to this message, right?
Yeah, that's right. But if we look at the message of the cross, it's he's given up everything. And for us, everything to gain is ours. So in that contract where he entered into, he doesn't really gain anything. We gain everything.
You mean the covenant, right?
The covenant, right. Also, like there's an example in the Old Testament where God makes a covenant with Abraham. And in those days, they would cut, I think, a bull or an animal in half, and both parties would have to walk through after they make this covenant. But in that one case, I remember God put Abraham to sleep. I think it was Abraham, and God himself walked through the animal.
Yeah, it was Abraham.
So, meaning that only God is the one that's able to keep the covenant.
Yeah, because we know that we've probably failed our end of the deal multiple times, and that's why we needed Jesus in the first place. Because I heard someone say one time that they wanted to get married that way. They wanted to enter into a covenant between their spouse by walking through a bull that's cut in half. So maybe we should bring that back as a true sign of covenant.
Well, maybe like before a barbecue or something. You could have
Yeah, that would be a good idea. Have some really good steak, burgers for the wedding feast. Well, we're running short on time here. We're coming up on 30 minutes. Just wanted to bring my dad, Alex Hromyk, on to the podcast. And you might agree with some of the things he said. You might disagree. But what is most important is that regardless of the era, the culture that you grew up in, and the church environment that you experienced, and the way that you worshipped, it all comes down to the covenant that Christ has established with us that we get to walk into. And we don't just get thrown to the wayside, whether we're wearing the suit or not. We don't just get thrown to the wayside depending on if we are financially stable during COVID or not. We don't just get thrown to the wayside depending on even our ability to have faith. It's all Jesus at the end of the day. So look forward to having Alex again in the future to have some more awesome theological discussions. And in a few weeks, we're going to have my friend Paul on the podcast to talk about culture and the church from a different perspective. Stay tuned. That is coming up. Thank you guys for listening to this episode of Theologize. See you guys next time.